she's a kind of a guide for how to live. And by live, I mean she's a guide for how to give back, how to use what you have to make the world a better place in a real way.
It took a long time for Ursula Guin to become the famous author Ursula Guin. In the 1950s, she started out writing more realistic novels, but they weren't catching on. And when she finally decided that her talents would be best used in science fiction or fantasy, I mean, you gotta remember, sci-fi was not cool back then.
It had no respect from the critics. It was not taught at all. Literature people knew nothing about it unless they found it for themselves.
Again, here's Ursula Guin from the upcoming documentary.
I kind of waded into the middle of that, and I knew that my work was not second-rate. I knew that what I was writing was of literary value. But it's sort of hard to be standing there saying, I know better than all of you do, for a long time. But my readers knew better, too.
She also wanted to write under her own name as a woman, which can still be challenging today. I mean, a lot of women will choose to initialize their first name and their middle name. And actually, early in her career, Ursula Le Guin was encouraged to publish a story under the name UK Le Guin. She did it once and vowed to never do it again. But she kept at it, and her big breakout came in 1968 with the novel A Wizard of Earthsea. The story was about a boy wizard who goes through a rigorous training at a hidden magic school where he can learn to master a complicated magic system. And yes, a lot of people have wondered if J.K. Rowling was influenced by Ursula Le Guin. In fact, Ursula Le Guin herself has speculated about that a few times. And back in the 1960s, as the feminist movement was gaining ground, the fact that Ursula Le Guin was a woman writing fantasy novels under her own name began to work in her favor. I mean, like many famous people, she also happened to be in the right place at the right time.
And as she says in the film, it was a very interesting moment for science fiction because science fiction was starting to kind of open its arms to other ideas beyond the technological, beyond the gadgetry and spaceships and, ray guns and silly things like that. And ideas about culture, ideas about identity, ideas about relationships were becoming more interesting to the readers and writers of science fiction. And also there were more voices. There were more women. There were more writers of color. There were different people kind of stepping into the fray and beginning to assert a place for themselves. And this is kind of the community that she stepped into. And she took that opening and really made the most of it by exploring very deeply these anthropological ideas in her work and asking people to really question some of the assumptions which they held closest, like the idea of a binary gender, for example.
Arwen is referring to one of Le Guin's most famous novels, The Left Hand of Darkness from 1969, which takes place on a planet where the inhabitants don't have a fixed gender.
And that really blew people's minds to be asked to think about these people who were neither men nor women. And even though she was criticized for making them too male, basically, many of the readers were just blown away by that exercise that they were asked to do. I think it was a powerful work that was ahead of its time, and it got people talking.
And that really became the signature of her writing, the, quote, thought experiment.
A number of writers bring up this idea of the thought experiment. And to some degree, that's what science fiction does most of the time, because it takes us someplace else and asks us to be there. Maybe that's what fiction does in a more general sense. But she really took this to this wonderful level with her ecumen system. She invented this universe of worlds that are connected by the ecumen, which is this sort of consortium of loosely organized planets that all are connected with each other. But each of these planets has people on them, but each one of them, in each planet, there are different circumstances and different factors and elements which shape those people to being one way or another. And it asks us to explore why we are the way we are and how we could be different.
But society was changing fast, and by the mid-1970s, this, liberal, groundbreaking author from Berkeley, California, found herself in a strange position as representing the old guard, the old way of doing things.
She didn't initially think of herself as a feminist, and she has said And she says in our film that she began writing from the point of view of a man, or point of view of a woman pretending to think like a man, I think is what she says. When Ursula began reading books as a child and when she began writing and publishing, the default voice, the default protagonist was a male. And the voice was from the point of view of a male hero. And she wrote that way. She accepted that default as most women writers did. And her early works are written from the point of view of these intrepid male heroes. And it wasn't until circumstances, both internal and external, caused her to think more deeply about her own perspective as a woman that her work began to change.
But change isn't easy.
The women's movement was happening. And initially, it was hard for her to be a part of it. She was a mother. She was a housewife when she began writing. She was deeply dedicated to her marriage. And those things did not seem to be compatible with the role of a feminist as she first saw it. But when she did begin to read women's writings and to listen to what they were saying, she realized that she was going to have to change her own perspective in order to actually speak from who she truly was. So it was a process of becoming. And because she is a writer, she was a writer through and through, it happened in her work. It was expressed through the things she was publishing. And so we can actually see that evolution taking place as we read her work and follow it in her fiction. And there's something that's very unusual about that, to basically say, okay, I was wrong about this. This isn't the only kind of hero we can have. Women's magic is not necessarily just weak and wicked, as it's described in the first Earthsea books. It's also powerful. It's also misunderstood. And that's what she comes again later to explore in the later Earthsea books. So she doesn't put down anything she did before, but she looks at it from a different perspective.
Which is funny because so often that's what she was so best known for, with her thought experiments and her anthropological take. To have so many people from the outside saying, actually, if you look at your own work, you also, that must have been a slight humbling lesson for her.
I think it was. And I'm sure that you've, talked to many creative people, and they don't often take criticism that well. It usually tends to trigger defensiveness. And sometimes they come back with the same thing they just did and sort of hit the point home harder. This is my stand. And instead of doing that, she was I think she took it all in. She felt all the defensiveness. And then she put it in what she called her compost, her creative compost. And what came out of it was this other voice that was her real mature self as a writer, her real mature presence that comes out in her later work and gives her such depth and integrity throughout her career. She wasn't just the bright spark who was able to write these exciting novels as a young woman. She was also a true master.
A few years ago, Ursula Guin announced that she would no longer be writing fiction. She didn't have the drive or the energy anymore. But she was still actively engaged with her fans, and she gave some fiery talks on the shortcomings of the publishing industry. Arwen had expected Ursula Guin to be there when the documentary was finished.
It was more like she entered into another phase of her old age where she had less mobility, she got tired more frequently, she had less stamina. I had adjusted personally to just that new pace in speaking with her and was in denial that it would have, that she was close to passing away. So I was not thinking of her as somebody who was going to die at any minute, not at all.
Arwen went into this project because she believed very strongly in the intimacy of film as a medium to get to know people. But since Ursula Guin has died, it's become kind of difficult to work with that footage, to edit it day in and day out.
Yeah, it's very difficult to look at her face and listen to her voice. There's a period, I don't know if this is something that fades over time, but right now the sort of shape of her absence is very large and very tactile to me. Like I can see the shape of her not being here, and it's this huge hole. I think that it's going to go on for a long time while it absorbs the magnitude of the loss to kind of the world of ideas, to the literary world, science fiction world, feminist thinkers. And just on a personal level, having spent, I've done a lot of evolution of my own while working on this project. And she has been a touchstone of kind of wisdom and common sense and integrity and, creative ingenuity throughout the process. And so there's always that impulse with it when a powerful person leaves of wanting to check in with them about any number of things and them not being there. And even about the loss itself, where if it were someone else who had passed away that I cared about, I would be asking her, I would be looking to her for wisdom about how I should proceed in the project and in my life. And of course, she's not here.
I mean, given that I know that you're the filmmaker and she's documentary subject, but do you feel like she became a friend or mentor? I mean, how would you describe your relationship as it evolved?
Both of those things, certainly. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I did have an intimate friendship with her, and almost like we're family in some way, which is not to say that we're family in the way that her real family is. But yeah, no, the loss is personal as well.
Now, even if there aren't any more Ursula Guin novels to come out, her influence is everywhere. I feel it every time I read a new author delving into speculative fiction with her own thought experiments.
Ursula Le Guin's legacy is easiest to see in how she left fiction behind her. When she came into it, science fiction and fantasy was something marginal, something silly, something trivialized. It maintained that status as being kind of laughable, kind of not really where real art happens for a long time. And it was partly because of her real insistence on being a real artist in that medium, in that genre, that genre is no longer considered off limits for serious artists. So artists like Michael Chabon and Margaret Atwood and David Mitchell and Zadie Smith, and I could go on, can take fantastic elements, science fictional elements, and weave them into their work, and just be novelists who have just as much chance of writing a great novel that ends up on the New York Times bestseller list as anybody else.
Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for listening, and special thanks to Arwen Curry for providing me with clips from her upcoming documentary, Worlds of Ursula K. Le Guin. The documentary will premiere at film festivals this summer, and it will be on public television in the U.S. in the fall. It also features interviews with Michael Chabon, Margaret Atwood, Neil Gaiman, and many others. Oh, and I learned one more interesting tidbit. I mentioned to Arwen how strange it was that there'd been hardly any good TV or movie adaptations of Ursula Le Guin's work. Well,
I think it's coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't speak about any of the details, but I think it's on the way.
In fact, just a couple days after we talked, I read that Ursula Guin's novel The Telling is going to be adapted to a movie by the producers of Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek Discovery. So, hopefully there's more to come. Imaginary Worlds is part of the Panoply Network, and for a long time I've been saying I'm a one-man band. That is no longer true. My assistant producer is Stephanie Billman. You can like the show on Facebook. I tweet at E. Malinsky, and my website is imaginaryworldspodcast.org.